The floor was the first thing she noticed when she walked into the cabin on the 40 acres in September of 1869, and it was the last problem she solved before the Vermont winter made the solving urgent. The floor was cold in a way she understood immediately and did not need to measure. The cold came up through the board surface the way cold always came up through uninsulated floors in the Green Mountain September, which was early and thorough and specific to the contact between foot and board. The cold of ground that had been shaded all summer and was ready to be colder still. She pressed the sole of her boot against the floor planks and felt the cold through the leather, and she thought, "This will be the floor's temperature in September. In January, it will be worse."
Okay.
She had 40 acres and the cabin on it and $5 in the tin box, and October 31st as the date by which she had to be gone from the house she had shared with her husband Alphonse on the rented farm in the valley below. Alphonse had died of the consumption in August, 4 years after the consumption had first made itself known in the coughing that started in the winter of 1865 and that she had known from the beginning. Was the consumption because her mother had died of it in sight in 1848, and she recognized it by sound before the doctor named it? She had had 4 years of knowing, and the knowing had not made the August easier, only more specific in its grief. The farm in the valley belonged to the Cutler family, who had been good landlords in the way that landlords were good when the rent was paid and the land was worked, and who had told her in September that the farm would go to their nephew in November, and that they were sorry, but the arrangement that had suited the 4 years of Alphonse's tenancy could not continue with a widow farming alone on 60 acres. She understood. She said so. She had 40 acres she had filed in her own name in 1867 under the Homestead Act, the specific provision that allowed a widow or unmarried woman to file, which she had done with Alphonse's encouragement and the $10 from the sale of 2 pigs. The 40 acres were hers. The cabin on the 40 acres was a 14 by 6 structure of single-wall board construction that a previous settler had built and abandoned in 1865 when the Vermont hillside proved less hospitable than he had planned. And it was sound in its structure, but cold in all the ways that single-wall board construction was cold, which was through the walls and through the floor and through the window frames and through every gap the Vermont winter could find. Her name was Célis Bouchard-Nez Tremblay. She was 38 years old, born in Saint-Tite, Quebec, and she had come to Vermont with Alphonse in 1858. Following the movement of French-Canadian families southward into the Green Mountain farming communities that had been absorbing Quebec immigrants since the 1840s. She had been farming the Vermont hillsides for 11 years, and she knew the Vermont winter by direct experience and by the specific knowledge of cold floors that the Green Mountain winters produced in single-wall cabins built without attention to what happened under the boards. What happened under the boards was frost. The frost entered the subfloor space from all sides in November and December. The cold ground around the cabin perimeter, conducting the surface cold downward and inward until the ground under the cabin was as cold as the ground outside it. The subfloor space filled with the same frost-cold air as the outside, the boards above that air conducting the cold upward into the room and into the feet of anyone standing on them. She had lived with cold floors for 11 years in the valley cabin, and she had managed them with the techniques available: thick wool stockings, braided rag rugs over the worst sections, a cast-iron stove positioned to warm the floor area around it, and no other. The techniques were adequate for the valley cabin, which had been built with more care than the hillside cabin, and which had a partial stone foundation that held some of the floor edge above the frost. The hillside cabin had no foundation. The boards lay directly on joists that lay directly on the cold ground. And the September floor she pressed with her boot sole was the floor she would have in January, only colder. She thought about the floor for 3 days before she remembered what her father had built around the root cellar at the family farm in St. Tite. Her father Edord had dug the root cellar in 1851, cutting into the slope behind the farmhouse to a depth of 6 feet and lining the walls with fieldstone from the north pasture. The root cellar was warm, the earth kept at 45 to 48 degrees through the Quebec winter, but the floor of the root cellar was damper than her father wanted, the moisture seeping through the stone floor from the hillside above during the spring thaw and remaining through the summer. Her father's solution had been a drainage trench cut around the perimeter of the root cellar exterior, 2 feet deep and 12 inches wide, filled with creek gravel to allow the seeping moisture to drain away before it reached the root cellar walls. The trench was a drainage device, not a thermal device. Her father dug it for water, not for warmth. But the winter, after the trench was dug, she had noticed, she had been 19 and noticing things. That the root cellar floor was drier, and also that the root cellar floor was warmer than it had been before the trench. Not dramatically warmer, but the specific cold that had come up through the stone floor in January before the trench was less present after the trench. The root cellar floor, in January of 1852, was warm enough to stand on without discomfort, where in January of 1851 it had been cold enough that she had put boards down to stand on when working in the cellar. She had not thought about why the trench had warmed the floor until September of 1869, standing in the hillside cabin pressing her boot against the cold boards, when the memory of the warmer root cellar floor in 1852 connected to the cold floor problem in front of her and produced a question. Had the drainage trench changed the thermal properties of the ground under the root cellar? She thought about this for 1 day and concluded, yes, and in a specific way. The gravel-filled trench around the root cellar perimeter had been dug to 2 feet depth, but the gravel fill had settled over the winter and spring of 1851 to 1852, and the spring moisture had packed the gravel further. And by the winter of 1852, the effective depth of the gravel column was closer to 30 inches than before. At 30 inches in Quebec hillside soil, the bottom of the gravel column was below the frost penetration depth for most of the winter. The bottom of the gravel column was in contact with the earth at a temperature above freezing. The gravel conducted heat, not as well as metal, but gravel was a better heat conductor than dry sand or dry straw, which were good insulators specifically because they did not conduct. The gravel in the drainage trench, with its bottom in contact with the above-freezing earth and its top exposed to the cold winter air, was conducting heat upward from the warmer earth below toward the colder surface above, and the root cellar wall was in contact with the gravel along its full depth, including the section of the wall that was at or below the floor level of the root cellar. The gravel had been conducting earth temperature heat into the root cellar wall at the floor level. The root cellar floor was in contact with the root cellar wall at its base. The warmth had conducted from the gravel column into the wall and from the wall into the floor. A small amount of warmth, moving slowly by conduction. Enough to make the January floor noticeably warmer than it had been before the drainage trench was dug. She had been 19 in 1852 and had noticed the warmer floor without understanding why. She was 38 in 1869 and understood why without having planned to understand it. The 40 acres had a creek. The creek had gravel. She had a spade and a mattock and $5. The $5 went to the iron pins she would need to create the sill gap between the cabin floor joists, and the ground. The small separation that would allow the subfloor space to exchange warmth with the gravel trench at the cabin perimeter. Without the sill gap, the floor joists rested directly on the cold ground, and the only exchange between the trench and the subfloor space would be through the soil itself, which was a slower path. With the sill gap, 3 inches of space between the joist bottom and the ground surface, maintained by iron pins driven into the ground every 2 feet along the perimeter, the subfloor space would be open to the trench at every point along the cabin perimeter. She bought the iron pins at the Montpelier Merchant on the first October trip she made for winter supplies. 12 pins at 25 cents each, $3. The remaining $2 she spent on additional lime for the clay plaster she would need to seal the exterior of the trench top against rain infiltration. She began digging on October 8th. The trench she planned was 5 feet deep and 18 inches wide, running along all 4 sides of the cabin perimeter at a distance of 12 inches from the cabin wall. 5 feet of depth to reach the earth temperature zone that she estimated, from her root cellar experience, was at approximately 4 to 5 feet in Vermont hillside soil. 18 inches of width to provide a sufficient volume of gravel for the thermal conduction she needed. 12 inches of distance from the wall to allow the trench gravel to be in direct contact with the air in the subfloor space through the sill gap. The Vermont hillside clay was harder than the Quebec hillside clay had been, drier and with more stone content, and the spade required more force per stroke than she had estimated from the Quebec digging memory. She revised her schedule after the first day and accepted that the full perimeter trench would take 12 days rather than the 8 she had planned. It took 11. She dug the last section of the east wall trench on October 18th, 12 days after she started, and she spent October 19th and 20th hauling creek gravel in the wheelbarrow from the creek edge 40 yards north of the cabin to the open trenches, filling each trench section from the bottom up, compacting the gravel with a tamping pole at every 2 feet of depth. She drove the iron pins on October 21st, working around the cabin perimeter and driving each pin to the ground at 2-foot intervals, the pins establishing the 3-inch gap between the lowest floor joist and the ground that would allow the subfloor space to connect to the trench. She sealed the top of the trench on October 22nd with the clallam plaster, covering the gravel surface with a 2-inch layer of mixed clay and lime and smoothing it level with the surrounding ground, with a slight crown to direct rainwater away from the trench rather than into it. She moved on to the 40-acre claim on October 31st, the last day before the Cutler farm went to the nephew. The first week of November was cold but not severe. The Vermont November temperature staying between 15 and 25 degrees at night. She pressed the floorboards each morning before lighting the stove and found them at 32 to 34 degrees, cold to the touch, but noticeably less cold than the boards had been in September when the trench was not yet dug. The September boards had been at 28 degrees on a 34-degree morning. These were at 32 on a 20-degree morning. She recorded November 8th. Outside 19 degrees. Floor surface 32 degrees before morning fire. September floor on same morning temperature, approximately 28 degrees at 34 outside. Floor warmer despite colder outside temperature. Trench functioning. The neighbor, whose farm abutted her eastern boundary, came to look at the trench on November 15th. His name was Gideon Paquette, a French-Canadian farmer who had been on his claim for 6 years and who had heard from his wife that the widow Picard had dug a trench around her cabin for some purpose he had not been able to determine from the road. He pressed the gravel surface of the trench with his boot and said, "What does a trench do for a cabin?" She said, "The gravel at the bottom of the trench is at 46 degrees, the same as the earth, at 5 feet depth. The gravel conducts that warmth upward into the subfloor space of the cabin. The floor is warmer," he said. "The gravel heats the floor," she said. "The earth heats the gravel. The gravel conducts the heat to the subfloor space. The floor above the subfloor space is warmer than it would be without the trench." He looked at the trench for a moment. He said, "How much warmer?" She said, "I will know better after the first hard freeze. Come back then." He came back after the first hard freeze, which was December 14th. When the overnight temperature reached 11 below zero and the ground surface at the cabin exterior cracked audibly in the night from frost expansion. She had slept on the floor that night, which was her method of checking the floor temperature without the stove's influence. The floor directly under her body weight, before the morning fire, on the coldest night of the season so far. She recorded December 15th. Overnight, 11 below zero. Floor surface before fire, 29 degrees. Slept on floor, assessed by direct contact, no frost on board surface. Subfloor space temperature, estimated 32 to 34 degrees. Neighbor Fortier, whose cabin has no trench, reports floor frost visible on her boards this morning. No frost on her boards. Frost visible on the neighbor's boards at the same outside temperature. The blizzard came in February of 1870. 3 days of wind and cold that brought the temperature to below zero on the second night, and that buried the valley below in 4 feet of drifted snow. She recorded its effect on the floor with the specific attention she had been applying to every cold event since November. She recorded February 9th, second day of blizzard. Outside 25 below zero. Floor surface before fire, 26 degrees. No frost on boards. Subfloor estimated 30 degrees. Gideon Paquette, who visited before the storm, reports his cabin floor at 18 degrees yesterday morning. His floor has no trench. The trench held 8 degrees of floor warmth through the worst night of the winter. 8 degrees of floor warmth through 25 below zero. 8 degrees was the difference between frost on the boards and no frost. 8 degrees was the difference between floors cold enough to require boards laid over them and floors cold enough to be walked on in wool stockings without pain. 8 degrees from a tranche of creek gravel and $5 of iron pins. 8 degrees that the neighbor's floors did not have. Gideon Paquette dug his own trench in April of 1870. As soon as the frost left the Vermont hillside soil enough to allow spade work, his wife Marguerite had been pressing him to dig it since February, when she had walked on Sally's floors during the storm and found them tolerable under wool stockings, while her own floors required the rag rug over the boards and stockings over the rug, and still produced the specific pain of floor cold in the second hour of a Vermont winter morning. He dug to 4 feet rather than 5, because the Vermont clay on his claim had more stone content than hers, and the last foot was slow and painful, and the 4-foot depth produced a gravel temperature at the bottom of approximately 42 degrees, rather than the 46 she had at 5 feet. His floor improvement was measurable but slightly less than hers, which she told him when he showed her his measurements in November of 1870. She said, "The last foot is worth digging." The temperature at the bottom of the gravel column is the temperature that drives the conduction upward. Every additional foot of depth adds 2 to 3 degrees to the gravel bottom temperature, until you reach the stable earth temperature zone at 5 feet. After 5 feet the improvement is minimal. He dug the additional foot the following April, extending the trench from 4 feet to 5 on the east and west walls, where the stone content was manageable. The floor improvement in the winter of 1871 was noticeably better than in 1870. By the winter of 1872, 4 farms in the Vermont hillside settlement had gravel trenches around their cabin perimeters. The knowledge had moved through the French-Canadian farming community the way practical knowledge always moved. Through the women's networks that traded seed and recipes and medical knowledge, and when the occasion arose, the specific wisdom of how to make a Vermont floor warm enough to stand on without pain in February. Celise had not charged for the knowledge. She had shown Marguerite Paquette her floor and her measurements, and the measurements had been the argument. The same way Louisa Henkel's fuel numbers had been the argument in Pennsylvania, and Nora Walsh's Nodarath floor had been the argument in Oregon. The measurements spoke. The floor spoke. The woman who wanted warm floors understood before the explanation was complete. She proved up her claim in 1872 and farmed the 40 acres for another 23 years. Dying in 1895 at the age of 64, the gravel trench was still functional in 1895, maintained by adding gravel to replace what had settled and renewing the clay limb surface plaster every 3 years. 25 years of Vermont winters, and the gravel at the bottom of the trench was still 46 degrees in January, and the floor of the cabin was still 8 degrees warmer than the untrenched floors of the cabins that had not known to dig. $5. 11 days of digging. Creek gravel, she hauled herself in the wheelbarrow from 40 yards. The earth at 5 feet was 46 degrees. It had always been 46 degrees. She had dug a path for that warmth to travel upward into her floor, and it had traveled every winter for 25 years without asking anything of her except that she'd keep the trench clear and the plaster sealed. The floor was warm. The blizzard had been the test. The gravel had held. Her father had dug a drainage trench in St. Tite in 1851 for water. She had remembered a warmer floor in 1852. She had understood why, in 1869, 18 years between the observation and the application. The observation had waited. The application had arrived when the floor was cold and the Vermont winter was coming, and the $5 were in the tin box, and the creek gravel was 40 yards away. She had dug. The warmth had traveled. The floor had held. The physics of the gravel trench floor heating require precise prescription because the mechanism is subtle and was genuinely not understood by anyone who saw the trench before Celise explained it, including Gideon Paquette, who pressed the gravel surface with his boot and saw a hole in the ground, and could not derive from those 2 observations alone what the hole was doing to the floor inside the cabin. The mechanism has 3 components operating simultaneously, and understanding each separately is required before understanding how they combine. The first component is the stable earth temperature at depth. The earth, at 5 feet below the surface in Vermont, maintained approximately 46 degrees year-round, for the same reason that Mabel Hennessy's pit dwelling in Indiana was 48 degrees, and that Louisa Henkel's buried air intake delivered 43-degree air in December. The earth below the frost line responded to the annual average air temperature rather than to the daily or seasonal surface variation. 5 feet of soil insulated the earth below it from the surface, cold, the way 5 feet of any insulating material would insulate anything, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. The second component is the thermal conductivity of gravel. Gravel conducts heat better than dry sand, better than dry straw, better than the clay soil that surrounded it. This is why Frida Voss, in Wyoming, had filled her frost trench with dry insulating material. She wanted to block heat transfer, and dry insulating material blocked it. Celeste wanted to enable heat transfer upward, and gravel enabled it. The same trench geometry, opposite fill materials, opposite thermal functions. The gravel column in the trench had its bottom in contact with 46° earth, and its top exposed to winter air at whatever temperature the Vermont surface had reached. A column of material with 46 degrees at the bottom and, say, 15 below zero at the top, a 61-degree temperature difference, will conduct heat from the warm end toward the cold end at a rate determined by the material's conductivity and the cross-sectional area of the column. Gravel, packed at the density that compaction and settling produced, conducted heat at approximately twice the rate of undisturbed clay soil. Twice the rate meant the warming effect traveled upward through the gravel column twice as fast as it would through the natural soil. The third component is the subfloor connection. This was the element that her father's drainage trench had provided accidentally. The root cellar wall was in contact with the gravel at floor level, and that she replicated intentionally with the iron pin sill gap. Without the gap, the gravel's warming influence on the subfloor space had to travel through the sill timber and the floor joist, which were wood, which was a decent insulator and a slow conductor. With the gap, the warmed air in the gravel column base was in direct contact with the air in the subfloor space, and the heat transfer was by convection and conduction simultaneously rather than by conduction alone. The combined effect, 46-degree earth at the trench bottom. Gravel, conducting upward at twice the clay rate, subfloor space, receiving the conducted warmth through the sill gap at all four perimeter walls simultaneously. The subfloor space, enclosed on four sides by gravel columns, conducting earth warmth upward, held at approximately 30 to 32 degrees during the Vermont winter rather than the 15 to 18 degrees that an untrenched subfloor space reached. 30 degrees versus 15 degrees in the subfloor space. The floorboards above the subfloor space conducted temperature from the subfloor air upward into the room. 30-degree subfloor produced floorboards at 28 to 30 degrees. 15-degree subfloor produced floorboards at 16 to 18 degrees. 12 degrees of floor warmth from the trench. The measurement she recorded on the worst night of the winter, 25 below. 26-degree floor versus 18-degree neighbor floor was 8 degrees of improvement. The 12 degrees she had estimated from the mechanism was somewhat overstated by the fact that the gravel column near the surface was colder than she expected on the coldest nights, reducing the heat flux at the top of the column. 8 degrees rather than 12. Still, the difference between frost on the boards and no frost. 8 degrees from the mechanism her father had created accidentally in Saintite in 1851, while trying to drain his root cellar, and that she had observed in 1852 without understanding it, and that she had understood in 1869 while pressing a cold floor with her boot sole on a September morning on the Vermont hillside. The mechanism had been working in Saintite for 18 years before she understood it. It worked the same in Vermont as it had in Quebec because the physics of heat conduction through gravel did not change between provinces and states. She had understood it and built it correctly on the first attempt. The first attempt was correct because she had 18 years of the observation in her memory and had had the September to think about what the observation meant and to design the trench from that understanding before the frost came. The frost came. The trench held. The floor was warm. The 11 days of digging October 8 through 18, 1869, contained decisions worth describing because the work itself revealed conditions she had not anticipated and required adaptations she had not planned. And because the adaptations she made during the digging were the same kind of in-field problem-solving that every practical construction required of the person doing it alone without assistance. The first problem was the stone content. The Vermont hillside soil was a glacially deposited mix of clay and fieldstone in proportions that varied from section to section of the perimeter. The south and west walls of the cabin sat on relatively clear clay with occasional stones she could dig around or leva out with the mattock. The north and east walls sat on a deposit of larger stones mixed into the clay at a density that made, by 5-foot depth digging, genuinely difficult at several sections. She had 3 options for the difficult stone sections. Abandon the 5-foot target depth and accept a shallower trench on those walls, which would reduce the thermal performance of those sections. Spend extra time breaking through the stones with the mattock and iron bar she had for rock work. Or root the trench around the stones where possible, maintaining depth by increasing the trench width. She chose the second option for stones small enough to be broken or levered free, and the third option for 2 large fieldstones on the northeast corner that were deeper than she could lever and wider than the mattock could break in any reasonable time. She rooted the trench around the 2 large stones, extending the trench width from 18 inches to 30 inches at that section to maintain the 5-foot depth beside rather than over the stones. The wider section held more gravel than the standard section, which improved rather than reduced the thermal performance at that corner. She noted this in the building instructions she wrote the following winter. Widen the trench around immovable stones rather than reducing depth. The extra gravel volume at the wider section may slightly improve performance. The second problem was water. At 4 feet of depth on the north wall, the spade broke into a seam of clay that was visibly wetter than the surrounding soil, the moisture seeping slowly from the cut face as she worked. The wet seam indicated groundwater moving through the clay at that depth, which was common in Vermont hillside soils with impermeable clay layers above more permeable material. The wet seam was not a problem for the drainage function. The gravel would handle moisture as well as it handled heat. But it was a potential problem for the structural stability of the trench walls during the filling phase. Wet clay did not hold its cut face as well as dry clay, and she had seen trench walls fail under the weight of wet soil before, in the drainage work that farm maintenance always required. She solved this by cutting the wet section wider than standard, reducing the height-to-width ratio of the trench wall at that section, which reduced the likelihood of wall failure. She also moved more quickly on the filling at the wet section, not letting the cut faces stand open longer than 1 day before gravel was in place against them. No wall failure during filling. The wider cut had been the correct response. The third problem was the gravel quantity. She had estimated 40 wheelbarrow loads of creek gravel would fill the full perimeter trench. The actual quantity was 53 loads, because the gravel settled more than she estimated after tamping gravel in a natural stream is loosely packed. Gravel compacted into a trench settles to a denser packing that reduces volume by approximately 20%. She made 13 additional gravel hauls after running short on the 3rd day of filling, which added 1 full day to the filling phase. She added the settling allowance to the building instructions, planned for 25% more gravel than the trench volume calculation suggests. The gravel settles after filling and will require topping up. The iron pins she drove on October 21st without difficulty. The Vermont clay in mid-October still soft enough at the surface for pin driving with the mallet. She drove each pin to the correct depth in one sequence, working around the perimeter continuously rather than stopping and starting by wall section. Because the consistent driving force she developed by the third pin was better maintained through the full perimeter than rebuilt from scratch at each wall. This is the specific knowledge of repetitive manual work. The skill improves through the repetition, and interrupting the repetition loses the improvement. She had learned this in the Quebec kitchen from her mother's bread making, where the proper kneading rhythm established itself in the third minute and was lost if you stopped and had to be re-established. The same principle applied to pin driving. 11 days total, October 8th through 18th for the trench. October 19th and 20th for the gravel. October 21st for the pins. October 22nd for the plaster seal. 14 working days, not 11, she corrected in the building instructions she wrote in January of 1870. The original 11 was the digging phase only. The full construction was 14 days. Be accurate with yourself about the time. Be accurate with yourself about the time. She had written this for the next person, who would use the instructions and would plan their October construction and would need to know that 14 days, not 11, was the correct number to plan around. The instructions were accurate. The trench was correctly built. The floor held its warmth. She had been accurate with herself. She had given the next person the accurate number. That was also part of the knowledge. The accurate number given forward. The French-Canadian farming community in the Vermont Green Mountain hillsides had its own methods for managing the Vermont winter, many of them brought from Quebec and adapted to the Vermont conditions that were similar but not identical to the Quebec conditions they came from. Salisk's gravel trench was an adaptation of a Quebec practice, her father's drainage trench, to a Vermont problem, the cold floor, that the Quebec practice had not been designed for, but that it addressed nonetheless. This pattern, a practice brought from one place, solving a problem in a different place that the practice was not designed for, was a specific characteristic of immigrant knowledge. The way that tools and methods carried across distances encountered new problems and proved unexpectedly applicable to them. Her father had carried his drainage knowledge from the Quebec hillside farming tradition that stretched back to the French colonial settlements of the 17th century. The drainage trench was common practiced in Quebec hillside root cellar construction. She had brought the observation of its thermal effect to Vermont in her memory, and the Vermont problem had made the thermal effect the relevant part. The Quebec farmers who built drainage trenches around their root cellars did not know they were building thermal systems. They were draining water. The thermal effect was incidental, noticed by the people who were paying attention to floor temperature, which in the root cellar context was noticed principally by the women who worked in the root cellars and who stood on the floors and felt their temperature, and not formalized in any instruction or tradition, because no one had connected the trench to the warmth in a way that could be transmitted. She had made the connection in 1869, and she had transmitted it. The transmission was the building instructions she wrote in January of 1870, which described the mechanism as she understood it, the gravel conducting earth warmth upward, the sill gap allowing the warmth into the subfloor space, the floor above the subfloor space retaining that warmth, and which she gave to Gédéon Paquette in February of 1870 when he came back after the first hard freeze to ask how to build it. Gédéon had given the instructions to his neighbor Theodore Dion in March, and Theodore had built in April. and by the winter of 1870 there were 3 trench installations in the valley besides Celeste's. The instructions traveled in French, the language of the community, and spread through the community by the social channels that practical knowledge used, the men discussing it at the mill and at the feed store, the women discussing it at the needlework gatherings that happened at rotating farmhouses through the Vermont winter. The needlework gatherings were where Celise's explanation had been most effective, because the women who came to them were the women who stood on the floors and felt their temperature, and who had the specific motivation that cold feet in February provided to any practical improvement that offered warmer floors. The men had been interested in the fuel savings that a warmer floor implied. A warmer floor meant less cold air infiltrating upward into the room, which meant the stove had less cold air to heat, which meant less wood. The women had been interested in the floor itself, which they stood on every morning and which had been cold every winter since they arrived in Vermont. Both interests were served by the trench. The fuel savings were real. She estimated from her November and December measurements that the warmer subfloor space reduced her stove fuel consumption by approximately 12% compared to the same cabin before the trench was dug. 12% of a 4-cord winter was half a cord, which at Vermont wood prices in 1870 was approximately $1.20. The $5 of iron pins had paid for themselves in 4 winters of fuel savings. The gravel had been free. The digging had been her labor. She presented these numbers at the needlework gathering in January of 1870, the same way Louisa Henkel had presented fuel numbers to the skeptical farmers of Pennsylvania. The numbers were the argument. The women at the gathering had cold feet and fuel costs, and the combination of the two made the argument complete without any additional explanation required. By the winter of 1872, when 4 farms in the valley had gravel trenches, the knowledge had moved from the Vermont French-Canadian community into the English-speaking farming community through the one English-speaking woman who attended the needlework gatherings consistently, a woman named Abigail Marsh, whose farm bordered the Paquette claim and who brought the building instructions home to her husband and had him read them. Her husband Elias Marsh dug his trench in April of 1872 and the following February told the men at the Montpelier feed store that his floors were the warmest they had been in the 14 years he had been farming in Vermont. He attributed this to his wife's instruction. This is how the knowledge crossed the language boundary. A woman at a needlework gathering, cold feet, fuel numbers, a paper with instructions, a husband who trusted his wife's judgment, a feed store conversation in February. By the winter of 1874, 6 farms in the hillside community had gravel trenches. Celeste's original, Gideon Paquette Thudor, Dion, a 4th farm whose owner's name is not recorded in Celeste's notebook, and the Marsh farm, and 1 more English-speaking farm whose owner had heard from Elias at the feed store. 6 farms with warmer floors, $5 of iron pins apiece, on average. Creek gravel and labor. The Vermont winters continued. The floors stayed warm on the 6 farms. The other farms in the valley remained cold, their floors collecting frost on the coldest mornings. The women standing on rag rugs over cold boards and thinking about the warmer floors at the farms that had dug. Some of them dug in subsequent years. Some did not. The knowledge was available to anyone who asked, and N. Celise gave the instructions to everyone who asked and charged nothing for them, because the knowledge had come from her father's drainage trench in Seintite, and her father had not charged her for what he showed her. She gave forward what had been given to her, without charge, because that was how the kind of knowledge that lived in observation and careful noticing moved best. Freely, from one person to the next, accumulating with each movement the specific additions that each new user's experience produced. The instructions had begun as a description of what she had built. They had grown through Gideon's 4-foot correction and his 5-foot improvement, and through Dorés' stone rooting note and the gravel settling allowance and the 14-day accurate timeline, into a document that accounted for more conditions than she had encountered alone. Better instructions, warmer floors, the earth at 5 feet doing what it had always done, now with a gravel path to conduct its warmth upward to the people standing above it. The Vermont State Historical Society holds Silas Bouchard's notebook in its collection. Donated by her daughter in 1918, the notebook covers 26 years of farm records from 1869 through 1895, and the temperature measurements she recorded each morning through 25 Vermont winters form a record of the gravel trench's performance that is more detailed than any comparable documentation from the period. She measured every morning before lighting the stove, recording the outside temperature she read from the mercury thermometer nailed to the north wall exterior and the floor surface temperature she measured by pressing her palm flat against the boards for 30 seconds and recording her estimate. The palm estimates were not precise. She was not trained in thermometry, and she knew it, but they were consistent. The same method applied at the same time each morning for 25 years. And the consistency made them comparable across the record, even if the absolute temperatures were approximate. What the record showed, over 25 winters of consistent measurement, was that the floor surface temperature before the morning fire held at 27 to 2 degrees on mornings when the outside temperature was between 0 and 15 below zero. The floor never went below 25 degrees on any recorded morning. Even during the severe winters of 1873 and 1876, when the outside temperature reached 30 below zero, 25 degrees, the gravel trench at the depth she had dug it, in the Vermont hillside soil she had dug it in, maintained a floor surface temperature floor of 25 degrees. Regardless of the outside temperature during the winter events she experienced over 25 years, the floor did not track the outside temperature. It tracked the gravel temperature, which tracked the earth temperature at depth, which was stable. The earth was the stabilizer. The gravel was the conductor. The trench was the path between the stable earth and the cold floor. She recorded this interpretation in the notebook in the winter of 1875. After 6 years of measurements, the floor temperature does not follow the outside temperature because it is connected to the earth's temperature through the gravel, which does not follow the outside temperature either. The outside temperature varies from 60 above in August to 30 below in February. The earth at 5 feet varies from 44 degrees in March to 48 degrees in September, a 4-degree annual variation around a stable mean. The floor follows the gravel, which follows the earth. The floor is stable because the earth is stable. She had understood the mechanism in the summer of 1869 and had verified it through 6 years of measurement before she wrote the interpretation down. She was cautious about committing to an explanation before the evidence supported it. 6 years of consistent measurement in which the floor temperature consistently tracked a range of 27 to 32 degrees regardless of outside temperature was evidence she found sufficient. She wrote the interpretation once and did not revise it. It was correct. The subsequent 19 winters confirmed it without adding anything to it. She had been right in 1869 about why the root cellar floor in St. Tite had been warmer after the drainage trench was dug. She had been right, in the summer of 1869, about what a gravel-filled perimeter trench would do to her Vermont floor. The measurement record confirmed both rightnesses over 25 years. The building instructions she had written and revised through 1875 are also held in the Vermont State Historical Society alongside the notebook. 3 pages that had grown from the original 1 page through Gedion's corrections and the gravel, settling allowance and the stone rooting note and the 14-day timeline. The 3 pages were the last revision, made in March of 1875 after the 6th winter of data, and they remained unchanged from that revision through 1895. She had not needed to revise them after March of 1875 because the instructions were correct by then, and the subsequent 20 winters had not produced a problem the instructions did not address. The 3 pages were complete. The mechanism was understood. The floor was warm. 25 winters. 3 pages. $5 of iron pins. 11 days of digging. Creek gravel she had hauled herself from 40 yards away. The earth at 5 feet in the Vermont hillside had been 46 degrees since before she arrived on the 40 acres, and would be 46 degrees long after she was gone. She had given it a path to the floor, and it had taken the path and used it and kept the floor warm every winter for 25 years. Her father had given her the observation. The observation had waited 18 years. The floor had been cold, and the creek had had gravel, and she had understood in September of 1869 what she had seen in 1852. She had dug. The warmth had come. The floors had held. That was what it had become. That was what the $5 and the gravel and the 18-year-old observation had built in 14 days in October of 1869 in the Vermont hillside. The earth had been 46 degrees at 5 feet of depth. The gravel had conducted. The floor had held. 25 winters. It held every one. There is one more element of the account that deserves its place, which is the specific moment in February of 1870 when Gédéon Paquette came back after the first hard freeze, as she had invited him to, and she showed him the floor temperature measurements from December 14th and 15th, alongside what his wife had reported from their cabin floor on the same morning. He had stood in her cabin pressing the floorboards with his boot, the same way she had pressed them in September. He said, "Yours are warmer," she said. 29 degrees before the morning fire on the coldest morning of the year so far. Outside 11 below, he said. My wife said ours had frost on them. She said, yes. The frost forms when the board's surface is below 32 degrees. 29 is above the frost point. He pressed the floor again. He said, by 3 degrees. She said, 3 degrees is the difference between frost and no frost on the boards. He was quiet. He pressed the floor one more time with the flat of his hand rather than his boot, the same way she pressed it each morning. He said, I will dig in April. She said, dig to 5 feet, not 4. The last foot is the one that makes the difference, he said. How do you know it is the last foot? She said. I do not know for certain. I know the earth at 5 feet is 46 degrees, and the earth at 4 feet is 42 degrees, and I know that the bottom of the gravel column drives the conduction upward. For more degrees at the bottom of the column means for more degrees of driving force for the heat transfer. I believe it will produce a measurable improvement in floor temperature. He said, you believe it? She said, I believe it from the mechanism. I will know it after you dig to 4 feet and we compare your floor to mine, and then again after you dig the 5th foot and we compare again. He dug to 4 feet in April of 1870 and came to her in November of 1870 and showed her his measurements. His floor was at 24 to 25 degrees on the coldest mornings, 2 to 3 degrees colder than hers, consistent with the mechanism she had described. He dug the 5th foot in April of 1871. His floor in November of 1871 was at 28 to 29 degrees. Within 1 degree of hers, he came to her in November of 1871 and showed her the measurements and said, "The 5th foot was worth digging." She said, "Yes," he said. "You told me it would be." She said, "I believed it from the mechanism, confirmed it with the measurement. Both are necessary. The mechanism tells you what to believe. The measurement tells you whether to keep believing it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The mechanism told you to dig the trench." She said, "The mechanism or the observation from St. Tite, which is where I first saw the mechanism working without knowing it was the mechanism." He said, "Your father's drainage trench." She said, "Yes. He dug for water. I dug for warmth. The gravel did both." This exchange is not in the notebook. It is in a letter Celeste wrote to her sister Odette in St. Tite in December of 1871, which the Vermont State Historical Society holds in its collection with the notebook and the building instructions. She described the exchange to her sister because she thought her sister would understand it, the father's trench in St. Tite. The memory carried to Vermont, the warm floor confirmed over 2 years of Getty and Paquette digging in stages. She wrote, "Papa dug for water, and I watched and remembered. And 20 years later, I dug for warmth, and the gravel did both." I think he would have found this interesting. He always preferred knowing why a thing worked over simply knowing that it worked. She had preferred the same. She had known why the trench would work before she dug it, from thinking about the root cellar floor in St. Tite, and she had dug it and confirmed what she knew, and the confirmation had been the floor at 29 degrees on the coldest morning of the winter. She had known why. The measurement had confirmed it. Both were necessary. She had dug. The gravel had conducted. The floor had held. That was all there was to it. That was always all there was to it. When the observation was good and the mechanism was understood and the work was done carefully and the measurement was recorded and kept, the earth had been 46 degrees at 5 feet. She had given it a path to the floor. The floor had held every winter for 25 years. Every winter. The earth held every time. The Vermont State Historical Society also holds a letter from Abigail Marsh, the English-speaking woman who had attended the French-Canadian needlework gatherings and who had brought the building instructions home to her husband, Elias. The letter was written to the Vermont Agricultural Society in 1876, 7 years after Celeste's first winter with the trench. And it described the gravel perimeter trench in English in terms that the Agricultural Society might publish in its quarterly bulletin. The Society published a brief summary in the spring of 1877 bulletin, noting the gravel-filled perimeter trench as a practical floor-warming technique. Originating in the French-Canadian farming community of the Green Mountain hillsides and adapted from root cellar drainage practice, the summary attributed the development to Celeste Bouchard of Washington County and described the mechanism in terms that Abigail Marsh had drawn from the building instructions. The gravel conducts earth warmth upward to the subfloor space through a sill gap maintained by iron pins, producing floor temperatures measurably above those in comparable untrenched cabins. The bulletin reached farming communities in 6 Vermont counties. Celeste received a copy in April of 1877. The same month that Rhiannon Davies's Earthon Solar Shelter was being described in the Ohio Extension Service Bulletin to States West. She read the summary and found it accurate, and wrote to the Agricultural Society with one addition. The 25% gravel overage allowance for settling, which the summary had not included, and which every builder would need to know to avoid running short, as she had on her third filling day, in October of 1869. The Society incorporated the addition in the following issue. The instructions were now in print, in English, reachable by Vermont farmers who had not attended the French Canadian needlework gatherings, and who would not have known that the warmest floors in the hillside community were warm because of a drainage practice brought from Quebec in the memory of a woman who had been 38 years old and cold-floored and observant, and who had understood in September of 1869 what she had seen in St. Tite in 1852. 18 years between the observation and the application. 7 years between the application and the English language publication. 25 years of Vermont winters, confirmed in the measurements she recorded every morning before lighting the stove. The earth had been 46 degrees at 5 feet of depth in the Vermont hillside for longer than anyone had been farming the hillside. It would be 46 degrees long after the last farm in the valley had gone back to second-growth timber. She had given it a path to her floor for $5.14 days of work. And it had taken the path and used it and kept the floor at 25 degrees above frost through every winter she measured. $5.14 days. The observation from St. Tite she had dug. The earth had given what it had always had to give. The floor had held. Every morning, every winter, for 25 years.